Part 3. The last thing I want to talk about is kind of what I think is happening now and why, even though for me to go was very improbable, but I was very devoted to it for a very long period of time. 30 years it took me to pull this off. But I really think that any of you that want to go, either, if you decide to purposely chart your course to go like I did, you could probably go in just a couple of years. But even if you're just going to go, I'm going to wait around until somebody provides me the easy solution that I can go buy a ticket for, even that's not very far off. I mean, we're now talking, maybe a decade or two, but much, much sooner than I think most people think. If you look at space up until basically now, space has been very expensive and very dangerous, relatively speaking. And things that are expensive and dangerous tend to be, understandably, uncommon. But that is the calculus that's already really changed profoundly. Right now, the shuttle is the most expensive and most dangerous way people can go to space. I mean, it costs about $300 million per astronaut to put somebody in space. The projections for safety for the shuttle is about 1 out of 70. There's a 1 out of 70 chance you'll kill the whole crew. And that, by the way, is something that, especially now that I've been to space, I won't take that ride. Even if it was free, I wouldn't do it. And the Soyuz, by the way, is far, far cheaper and far, far safer. It's only 50 million per astronaut, 1/6 the price or so, but it's 100 times safer. It's actually, the safety margins for it, even according to NASA projections, are 1 out of 10,000. And by the way, that's safe enough. I would still go every day if they would let me, and I can afford it. But that's plenty safe in my mind. But not for, it's not nearly as safe as an airline or even driving your car. But here's what's interesting that has changed. It's been 50 years since we began to put people in space. And the first 10 years of that, we went from having nothing in space to Sputnik to landing on the moon in maybe 12 years. But, basically in the first decade, we did all of what I'll call the true heavy lifting of getting things into space. And all that data is now basically in the public domain. But since then, the last 30 or 40 years, we've still only put 500 people or so in space. I'm the 483rd person to orbit the Earth in 50 years. So it's just stunning how much was done at the very beginning and how, even though we put a lot of people up, how little the technology has changed in the last at least 30 years. And if you look back at that first era, there was a vision of the vision of 2001, Space Odyssey, was that by 10 years ago, we'd all be living in these wagon wheel, artificial gravity generating space stations. And guess what? We never fulfilled that vision. And but I was of the generation first inspired by that. And there's a documentary now called Orphans of Apollo that describes people such as myself or my generation, many of you, that were inspired by Apollo, but then this vision was never fulfilled. Therefore, we were orphaned by it. So we were inspired by this to go into science and technology, but then were abandoned. And what's interesting about that is that same group of people is the group of people, which again represents a lot of the people in this room, who even as long ago as 20 years ago, began to have this grassroots rebuilding of the privatization of space, starting with the Students for Exploration and Development of Space, going into the International Space University, rolling into the X Prize, Zero-G, and Space Adventures. And now, in fact, if you look at the heads of most of the prime contractors around Boeing, etc., they're all filled with SEDS graduates or ISU graduates who are all members of this new group that I think is really taking over the future of aerospace. And for example, a lot of these people who were inspired to go into high tech have gone and built business. They were inspired by Apollo to get into high-tech jobs. They helped America through this high-tech boom that we've just seen. And a lot of those same people are now returning to space out of passion. Because they were orphaned by it before, they're coming back now to kind of fulfill that dream that we never saw achieved for us when we were children. So, for example, you guys all know, I think there's a few folks from SpaceX here, I think, right now. But I think, SpaceX is doing a phenomenal job of already taking the cost of access to space down dramatically. And in their next two, what I call generations of vehicles, I believe they'll be able to drop it by yet another order of magnitude. You all know about Richard Branson, who has bought Spaceship Twos, which is now growth again of the X Prize of Spaceship One, the first private vehicle to fly twice in space. You know, Amazon.com, Jeff Bezos, one of the founders of Amazon.com, has a company called Blue Origin, which is also building first suborbital vehicles, but presumably eventually orbital vehicles. My favorite, because we're in business partners with him, you know, John Carmack, another game maker. The guy made Doom and Quake. You know, I was just last week, I guess a few days ago, I went to QuakeCon with John Carmack, where together we did a whole presentation about the future of spaceflight, because Space Adventures and Armadillo Aerospace now have both put money together to build a suborbital passenger-carrying vehicle. And in a minute I'll circle back and tell you why I think this strategy is actually the winning strategy from a cost and safety standpoint. The two hard things to do in space are cost and safety, and John's getting it right. You've also got another great group out here in California, X-Core Aerospace, just up in Mojave, also real close to Burt Rutan's shop. They're doing a single-stage to orbit spaceplane, or single-stage suborbital spaceplane, sorry. You know, you guys might know about Robert Bigelow, the Las Vegas hotel mogul, who wants to build private space stations. And if you look at the International Space Station, you know, we spent $100 billion over 20 years to build that. Robert Bigelow already has 2 of his inflatable stations in orbit right now. They're scale models, so you can't go live in them right now. But his next version he's going to put up will be habitable. And it'll be at a tiny, tiny fraction of the cost that we've paid previously to get up there. So whether you're going there as a hotel, space hotel, or you're going up there to do any research, he's going to be a very, very competitive option. And I would count myself amongst these people too, who again went off and did something in the high-tech arena and now have come back to space. And even the NASA prime contractors are getting on board. I mean, even they look at it and go, look, they already compete for launching satellites, where all we're doing is saying, just do the same thing for human space flight. And those guys are already kind of turning and burning, and I think will be major competitors going forward. But here's also one of the things, one of the main reasons, pardon me as I take a little drink, why I think that Armadillo Aerospace is doing such a great job. I mean, back in those early Apollo days, you know, rocket science was rocket science. It was hard. It had to be invented. Even the metal alloys they used to hold the fuel, the pumps to pump the cryogenic fuel around, all had to be invented. And you know, those were at temperatures and pressures and things that had never been faced before by engineering as an engineering problem. But now all those same materials are used in your air conditioner out behind your house. And so what's interesting about this is if you look at this Armadillo rocket, which now has the impulse capability of reaching space, they've invented some really clever pieces, like they have a non-ablative rocket nozzle, so it can be fired over and over and over and over again, which is great because previously rockets were used once and then thrown away, and so the technology didn't exist for making one you could fire over and over and over and over again, and that was something they had to invent. Very hard work, very brilliant work, congratulations to them. They also, John Carmack's a great software writer, he made a great command and control scheme, and they had to buy these special tanks that are used to hold their fuel and oxidizer at very high pressures and very low temperatures. Those were made out of special alloy made by a company that they contracted. Everything else in that rocket, everything else, you can and they do buy off the internet or out of a catalog. The computers are off the shelf, the accelerometer is off the shelf, GPS is off the shelf, all the pumps are off the shelf, all the valves and stepper motors off the shelf. You know, aluminum struts to hold it all up, off the shelf. Literally every school in the country or world that can compete in things like the first robotics competitions, give them a few tens of thousands of dollars, they can build a rocket that will fly to space. That is a completely, you know, people need to take it out of their mind, this whole thing about how hard space was. It's just not anymore. It's, you know, not only did John win the level 1 space, lunar lander challenge with this, but by the time they got around to competing with Maston on the level 2, there was the people that, the number 3 in the group was a father-son team working out of their garage, which literally are just right behind these guys in the ability to build rockets to fly to space. And so, you know, people just need to change your thinking fundamentally about how easy or hard it is to reach space. And so while the first tickets to space on a vehicle like this, might be in the hundreds of thousands, the fuel cost only costs about $15,000 in fuel to fly this sucker per person mass. And so, eventually that price would come down to the relatively small number of tens of thousands to go to space. So, I think it is a profound life changer. And you guys are probably already familiar with the fact that in February, NASA announced the cancellation of the Constellation program, the highly debated plan about whether NASA should be building their own heavy lift vehicles or lunar landers and that sort of thing. Personally, I think even though this may or may not remain canceled or canceled entirely, there's probably some middle ground that's going to be negotiated. But I actually think this was absolutely the right thing to do. That there's no reason that NASA should own their own vehicle. They really should rely on buying, just like they do for satellite launches, to launch their rovers that are running around on Mars. They should buy the same kinds of services to put their people into space, personally. And this is how I think the economics are changing. You already heard me say that it's 20 years and $100 billion to launch the space station, $2 billion a year just to keep it from splashing, $300 million to put an astronaut there. I mean, if I had to do some research and I had to pay my fair share of that cost, I cannot think of any research or any commercial activity that is worth that cost. And by the way, the amount of research and activity that's going on the space station so far in the last 20 years is close to zero. And so the value we've gotten back out of this investment is very minimal so far. And without significant changes going forward, even as bullish and pro-space and pro-NASA as I am, there have to be some fundamental changes in how this is operated even before this will start paying dividends that make it anywhere near worth the cost we've already paid. But here's the potential future. If you look at every other form of transportation other than a rocket, every fully reusable form of transportation, planes, boats, trains, and cars, all cost about 3 times the energy you put in it to operate it. So for example, if you spend $100 a month on gas, you probably spend another $200 a month on maintenance and insurance for your car. That's what I mean by that. And that same ratio is true for planes and boats and trains. But it's not true for rockets. And the main reason it's not true for rockets is, remember those 10,000 people it took to build one, and the 10,000 people it takes to operate it? And then what do after you launch it? You destroy it. And so imagine that every time you drove your car, every time you pull up at the gas station, you crush it and buy another. Well, people wouldn't drive very much either. And so that is the fundamental thing that must change for rockets to become affordable. But when you do, it will work out great. And so, for example, here we are right now where we have, it's about $100 million to launch the very cheap Soyuz. And down here at $5 million, this is about the amount of money I earned personally on my own spaceflight. And I'm not a professional space person. And what's interesting is if you go ask John Carmack or Elon Musk or any of these guys making rockets, they all believe that from this price, they're going to very quickly drop the first-person price. In their next generation, the rockets they're building right now, the price is going to come down to just over 10 to $20, $30 million price range. That's pretty darn close to the amount of money I earned on my own spaceflight already. And those guys believe in their next generation they're going to drop it to a fraction of that. In which case, the cost to get one person to orbit will be less than I could earn in space. And if you think that I'm not going back to space every chance I get if I can make a profit on it, of course I am. And by the way, so are you. Any smart entrepreneur who thinks they can make money in space will immediately do it as soon as this cost ratio becomes reasonable. And right now, it's way out of whack the wrong direction. But there's tons of very smart people who believe very confidently they'll be able to reverse this economics in a very short order. One of those businesses I think is going to be great is biology. Not only with my protein crystal growth stuff, but there's another company called Astrotech that's doing vaccine development for things, doing a great job too. But here's what I think is going to happen. So I think in the next couple of years you're going to see brainstorming suborbital happen, and my favorite again is Armadillo. And this is this is not their current drawing; it's just my favorite because I think floating in a glass bubble up to space and back would be pretty darn cool. But if they can't provide that, one of my plan is I'm going to go up on a lawn chair and jump off. So I'm going to go space diving. The